Hi everyone and welcome. We're excited that you could join us today for Thomas Leblanc's session, Query Store and Introduction. This past marathon features back-to-back live webinars delivered by expert speakers from the PaaS community. This session will be recorded and posted online after the event. You will receive an email letting you know when the recording becomes available. My name is John Zhang. I'm from New Zealand. I have a few introductory slides before I hand over the reins to Thomas. If you require technical assistance, please use the question pane located on the right side of your screen, and someone will assist you. This is also where you may ask any questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions at any time, and I will read your questions aloud to Thomas at the end of the session. Please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session, which will pop up after the session ends in your web browser. Your feedback is really important to us for the future events. So please take a moment to complete this. I'd like this opportunity to thank our presenting sponsor, HVR Software. This past marathon wouldn't be possible without their support. If you would like to learn more about HVR and their solutions, please visit the sponsors page in the past marathon website. Keep learning all year long. Visit PaaS.org and discover the free educational resources available to PaaS members. Connect, share, and learn. This session is presented by Thomas Leblanc. Thomas is a data warehouse architect in Baton Rouge and uses his 30+ years in IT to develop OLTP systems with a normalized database for high-performing T-SQL and dimensional data marts. As a past volunteer, he is the past chair of the Excel BI and Data Arc VCs and is active in the Baton Rouge Analytics and SQL Server user groups, as well as SQL Server in Baton Rouge. Okay, and without further ado, here is Thomas with Query Store and introduction.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you very clear.
Okay. I think I went out for a second there, so chat with me or send me a chat if you hear me go out again. Yeah, my name is Thomas LeBlanc. I'm a product manager at Idera and the Westgate product. Thank you, John, for moderating and Pass from hosting this. We're going to look at just a gentle introduction to the Query Store, which is basically some performance metrics that you can use in SQL Server, and it's specifically for SQL Server databases. So to start off, we'll just go through why would I use the Query Store? That's how we'll start this session, and we're going to migrate to the configuration of a Query Store. And it might seem like we spend a lot of time there, but it's definitely necessary to look at the configuration, because it's going to basically tell you what you can see and what you can't see. We'll kind of mention some of the different environments that might have changes in the configuration, or you have a configuration for this type of system versus that, or you might just have to play around with your configuration until you get it right. Then we'll go on to actually looking at an example. We'll add a column store index to a fact table, and it'll generate a new plan, and we'll kind of float around the different reports to see what it gives us as far as information about the change of the plan. And then the thing I like the best is there's a set of dashboard reports. We'll definitely look at the top queries and the track queries because I think that's where people kind of want to start. And then we'll end the session with some questions, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. And if your question doesn't get answered, we'll take them all, put them together. I'll get some answers for you and either post it on a blog or give it to the PASS to post on their website. So thanks for joining us, and we'll get started with why use Query Store. Even, what is the Query Store? So if you're a DBA or even maybe a developer or an architect in the data warehouse world, you have to go look at statistics about your queries and what's going on with them. So the choice today is to look at some data management views or data management functions or combination of the two, and extract some of the statistics about what's going on. You might even display an actual or estimated execution plan, some around the properties and so forth. But there's some problems with it, and the main one is when you reboot an instance or restart an instance, a lot or a majority of these statistics just go away, or you might even, or someone might even flush the cache. Hopefully not in the production system, but and then you might have to update statistics, in the middle of the night to improve the performance of some queries because of a volume of data that kind of skewed the different estimates that it's doing for rows in a particular table. And I put the word etc. at the end because I probably didn't cover everything that could affect the DMVs and DMVs in your system. So what does a query store do? The query store is database specific. So when you enable query store, you're enabling these execution plans, these query time, runtime statistics, and all this information about a query inside of a database. Now, what I noticed when this first came out was it was during the time that Azure databases started to come around, and it made a lot of sense. You heard the terms cloud first development by Microsoft. Well, they were putting this history in individual databases because you could spin up just an Azure SQL database. And by default, this stuff is turned on inside of there. And I believe the reason why, and this is just my opinion, but it could be true and it might not be, they could move that database around different installations of Azure. And so if it's moving from place to place to place, those statistics need to come with it. And I think that's what it was created, and it made a great option for us that had to stay on-premise and couldn't go to Azure. And really, you can actually back up and restore this database to Dev or QA. And I've even heard people say that you can do the clone database, and it'll keep this query store information available to you so you can examine it somewhere outside of a production machine, which is pretty cool if you ask me. And best of all, you control the flushing, and it's all with the configuration, which we'll look at next. But all additions, meaning enterprise standard, they all contain a query store abilities. One thing I read recently is there's some problems in some releases, so you always want to make sure your cumulative updates have been applied to whatever edition you're going towards, or if you have the time to read all the different problems that CUs fix, and you've got a lot of time on your hand that I really don't. But what's a good example of using this query store? So over on the right, I'm tracking a query, and if you notice over time, I can see the movement of the statistics. And in this case, we're looking at the average time duration to execute this particular query. And on the bottom, you could see the execution plan itself. And since the select statement is not large, you can actually kind of see it inside of there as well. I'll see if I can kind of point to these things to you. There's your query, and there's that flow, and then here's your execution plan. So in one of these reports, because of the query store, I'm able to look at a particular query, query ID 69, and I'm able to look at it over time. There's even a configuration, which is off to the right here, where you could change the time here. So these days, I can go from 2 weeks to a month to even a day, or even within a couple hours. So it's really cool what you can do there. And that's what it gives you. These runtime statistics can be aggregated over time. So you're not, if you have a very, very busy system, you don't want things individually stored. You might want to use the aggregates to help with the amount of data that's stored. We saw and pointed out that the query plan is below here to most of the different reports. If you're a more advanced DBA and you like to query the plans and the statistics, there's plenty of select statements that you can write yourself. That execution plan, though, is stored over time. There's retention to it, so you can look at them at every point. The plans might change within a query itself, so this is keeping track of the change in plans. I don't know if you could see this very clearly in this picture, but we'll look at an example. You can see here at this particular day and time, there's actually two different plans. There's number 1 and number 2. And we could look at what each plan is and actually compare those two plans, which is kind of cool. And that's a nice feature that Microsoft has added. I've watched Microsoft over the years, and I'm always kind of complaining about some stuff, but if I go look at old versions and the newer version, there's always something to be thankful for. So thank you, Microsoft, for improving all this, from just being able to read a text query plan to actually storing it in a database. So really, this is another performance tool for you. We can look at the plan history. If you notice in this particular plan that we have displayed, you can actually see the missing index right there. So you still have the missing index feature. You can see that I've clicked on a particular query here based on wait states. And I'm looking at the standard deviation of CPU, and I can see the different plans over time. And my standard deviation is not going too far off of 0. So the changes in the statistics for this plan are not great, but you can see it changing over time. And actually our last one is a new plan. So this guy actually got, recompiled into a different plan over time. Let me turn off this pen real quick and go to the next part. So the statistics is history, and it really tracks the basic ones. The basic ones I look at when I was a DBA and debugging stuff is your CPU usage versus your memory versus your IO usage, and it even will separate your logical versus physical reads. I notice it just has logical writes and not physical writes. But that's a different topic. But it's not set when you reboot, but it does get reset by you specifying the numbers of the days or the roll-up configuration when you do configure. And that's why that is one of the top subjects in here. So going to the configuration, we'll start with some basic stuff. If you notice, just like any other type of wizard you see in SQL Server, there's a button there by my red arrow for scripting. So, I could go in, start the configuration, change my operation mode to rewrite, hit that script button, and lo and behold, it produces my alter database script. So visually or through T-SQL, you could change this. We're turning, the query store on, making the operational mode read-write. There's two other modes, none and read-only, and we'll try to talk about those in a little bit. The next section is for monitoring. So we have a data flush and a collection interval. So the flush is how often how that collection is every 5 minutes I'm collecting, and every 15 minutes I'm flushing this stuff into my query store. So you could change those to more frequently. I would take the defaults for now, let it run, and then check the size of the actual query store, and that's what we're going to talk about next. And before that, that monitoring in these settings really depends on if you're looking at a transactional system versus a reporting system. Now that's very, very high level of what's a transactional and what's a reporting. You could drill down into more details of those types, but those two are the main types that split the way you configure this. So the next section is about retention. You have the size. So in 2019, the max size is a gig, but I think in earlier versions it's about 100 meg. So it's actually storing that data in your database, and it's storing, if you didn't know this, in the primary file group. So people who create databases with multiple file groups, you should be aware that this data goes in the primary file group. If you hit that max, that operating mode switches from read-write to read-only. Now, there's also some other thresholds like size-based cleanup mode, which in this example is on auto. I believe this is either a 2017 or 2019 feature that actually tries to clean up before you hit that max. So there is some intelligence of it to keep track. There's that stale query threshold, which says, hey, in 30 days, if I don't see a query that's been stored in here, then I can just, rotate it out of the query store. And yeah, this weight statistics capture mode, which I'm pretty sure is just 2019, that you could turn on and off. So weight statistics puts more data in this max size. So you have all this configuration to help control how this thing is set up. So let's demo the configuration. We'll try to stick away from all fluff, but show you some stuff. That was my old friend, Patrick Leblanc used to say that. And I want to focus in here over on the left to our Object Explorer, and we're looking at the AdventureWorks data warehouse, which has a folder for Query Store. But if we drill into the AdventureWorks 17, we'll notice there is no Query Store folder. When I right-click on the database and go to Properties, I see I have a Query Store property. And this is where we set all these things on or off. Also, you should be aware if you're upgrading machines, I'm on a 2019 instance, there's these options under the compatibility level of what compatibility your database is. So if you don't see some options in configuration, it could be that your database is in a different compatibility mode. So you want to verify what mode you're in to enable the different query store type of storage. So I'm going to go to the operation mode on and click read write, and that's really turning it on. For instance, if I script it, I could see there's my turning it on, and then there's my query store read write mode. So I could turn it on, just put read only, but nothing's going to happen. My flush intervals and my collection interval, I could change that, which you saw my example had 15 and the flush 15, but you might want the flush a little more than the collection. Now I'm just changing these to show you could change them. The max query plan, so it's saying I'll store 200 query plans, 200 plans with one query. I don't know if that's excessive or not. What I've read is that it's okay. The new default of a gig is a lot. Here's that auto capture mode, which used to be in previous to 19, defaults to all, so it would capture everything. What's interesting is auto has some intelligence to help clean the database up. And if you notice too, there is one called custom, which lets you customize some of the collection modes. It's a little more advanced, and I wouldn't suggest using custom unless you're an advanced DBA or more of a senior level DBA, because you could bring some contention or a lot of data to be collected in there. So start off with auto and see where it goes from there. There's your stale query threshold and my ability to turn the weight statistics on or off. I'm not going to turn this on, and I'm going to click cancel, and I'm going to right click on my existing one. The reason I'm doing this is I want to show you what's been going on with this one. You can notice in the bottom right, I have a little sliver of query store used. So far it's used a megabyte of the 50 available megabytes to store on my query store. And if you remember earlier, we talked about flushing. I'm not going to click it, but in this lower right, you have purge query data. So if it's filling up and you don't need that data no more, you hit that purge and that 1 meg will be gone. It's also nice that they show you on the left here the actual full, here's the full database. So it's telling you out of the 847 megs, only 1 meg is query store, which seems like a good proportion to me. But this screen gives you the ability to look at all that stuff. Even though you could do it with T-SQL, here you can actually look at it visually. Now, what I didn't really mention too, though, is when you hit this max, if I hit that max of 50, that database is going to go from read-write to read-only. And it's going to stop collecting new queries in their plans and the statistics. There's also an option, it's called turn off, even though the mode's still on, that will still collect the statistics of the existing queries, but not any new queries. And I'm probably getting a little bit too far. I'm going to cancel this and go back. I'm going to close that as well. I'm going to go back to the slides. So that was a demonstration of the configuration. I hope that was clear. If you had any questions, please put them in the question. But you can spend a lot of time in the configuration. A lot of what I've read and a lot of what I see of consultants as well as DBAs is that they make some settings and start running things and then watch it. I remember on Twitter, I saw Pound SQL Help tweet one time, and the guy said mine filled up within X amount of times, like within a day. And I told him, I think I responded to him, a couple of people did, says, why don't you just increase the size, your max size, and see what happens. And he did, and over the course of the next 15, 30 minutes, an hour, it gradually started filling and filling and filling. So what he had to do is he had to just sit back and examine his system and start eliminating some of the collection and extending the flush and the collection interval so it could better match his system. That custom mode that was added in 2019 even helps you filter more of the queries that are being captured, depending on how much time it takes, how much CPU usage. So it looks like Microsoft is building more and more abilities into it to configure that. If you're in Azure, it has a query store as well. I don't believe you can do much with the configuration based on the size that you pick in Azure is how much disk space it actually allows, like 10, 100 megs, and then I think a gig, it might be the largest. And that handles all in the background because of all their intelligence that are built in. But it still has that same being able to look at the statistics that we're going to see in just a second. So that's a demo of the configuration. And after looking at that, I wanted to mention here that there are some system tables where you can get this information. So if you are a DBA that loves T-SQL, loves PowerShell, you can control these things through T-SQL statements. You can even monitor them in T-SQL statements. So this is a very simple query that looks at the actual state versus the desired state, which are 2 columns in the database query store options. What I see a good use of this is you can monitor for the switches to read only. So you can have a SQL Server agent job or your favorite third-party monitoring tool that goes in and looks to see if this has changed. So you might write it, every hour to a table, check it within an hour and see if it's changed from read-write to read-only. Or you can actually look at the column that shows the size and compare the size of what you need. So there's really many things you could do as a DBA with it. So for instance, if I was setting something up like this, and I actually kind of did it in the system before, was I was switching this on and off. So I was changing from read-write to read-only, read-write from 7 a.m. to 6 when transactions and reports were running. SQL agent job would run at 6 p.m., turn it off. I do all my backups, re-indexing, update statistics, which is information I don't want to track in my query store. And then I turn it on back at 10 p.m. because in the middle of the night, and I had no control of when the ETL ran, but another scheduler would run ETL all through the night. And I wanted to track that particular set of statistics. So with these things and with this ability to do it in T-SQL, you can kind of control when and where you turn it off and what it collects, even if you want to do the flushing of it as well, or changing the configuration of it, excuse me. So that query capture mode is set to all in most configurations, but the default is auto in 2019. So just by Microsoft making that change, it seems relevant that the query capture mode probably shouldn't be on all and should be set to auto. So if they defaulted this in 2019, there must have been a reason why. Now, switching it to none when the collection is not needed is good. And when you switch it to none, what's really neat is the statistics are still captured on the existing queries, but no new queries are added. So if you know you got a system that doesn't really change the queries, you can still set it off so no new stuff goes in, and then the statistics are just kept on the existing queries. You know, why would you do that? Well, you might not want to fill up the query store with new queries. You might not be concerned about them. You might be just focused in on tuning some existing ones. And the more and more you get in there, the more you're having to look at. It's more distraction. So you're trying to turn off with this new custom and with this capture mode some of the noise that might be deflecting you from the real queries that you need a performance tune. So 2017, 2019 is when this weight statistics query capture came around. It wasn't available in 2016. There's some sort of open source query store out there that you might want to look into if you're on 2006 or previous. That might give you some more things. Definitely in 2019, you're limited in the queries captured. This auto for the query capture mode only comes on in 2019. But in 2019, which might be a good reason to upgrade, is that those various weight statistics can be customized now, so you can provide even more granular filtering of what actually is going to be captured, which is just beyond pretty neat. So let's keep going, and we're going to actually change a plan. So we're going to look at a query, which is a view that concatenates two fact tables together. It's from the AdventureWorks data warehouse. This view is called sales summary, but it's currently doing two clustered index scans, and we're going to add a column store to increase the performance of it. This is really the column store index, as far as I can tell. Analytical queries are what it best benefits, especially things with aggregations of columns. For instance, what we're going to look at in an example of processing a tabular model. It could be a cube. It doesn't have to be tabular if you're still using cubes, but it could be related more to the sums, counts, distincts, group bys than really your regular type of queries. So your queries in a transactional system probably don't do heavy queries like a select star from a view that pulls all the data out. But in our example, we're going to show that. So the query store shows this plan, and then you can actually look to see if this plan is better. So we're actually going to look at comparing the old plan to the new plan to actually see if it was better. Here's our column store index. I just put it in the slides in case people are interested. It's basically a non-clustered index that has every column in the fact internet cells. So we're just grabbing every column and we're stuffing it into a column store. It's non-clustered, so there's already a clustered index, probably the primary key on that particular fact table. So let's go ahead to a demo, and I'm going to switch to Management Studio. And just to give you an idea of some of those queries that I'm talking about, here's an example. You know, I'm grouping by the year, the calendar year, doing a sum, a sales. This is an example of a good query that might column store might take into account. And I've just been running these queries over and over again, and I keep adding more and more type of aggregations to it. And so as we run this over and over, it's piling up inside of my query store. I'm going to go to this guy right here, and I'm actually dropping, I don't know if any of y'all use now if exists. It's such a brilliant addition to T-SQL. I can drop index if exists. I'm going to switch to my my tabular model, and this basically does a lot of aggregations and a lot of measures. I'm going to the model, process all. It's going to go query all those dimensions and fact tables. It's actually going to look at that view that we were looking at, and we're going to switch back to Management Studio, and I'm going to go to this track queries. Let me close this and reopen it. So over here in the left under my database, AdventureWorks Data Warehouse 17, under Query Store, I have a series of reports. These are canned reports that are inside of SQL Server that they give you. I'm just going to go straight to tracked queries, and I know the query is number 69. And when I hit that, I can see the plan or the executions over time. I'm going to point this one out. What's interesting here is, here's one that's the duration is about 2.5 seconds, but then not too long after that is a duration of 3 seconds. Between these points in time, I went from reading from logical disk to reading from physical disk. So the change in time is not necessarily a problem for this. The problem was that I don't have it in memory anymore. And then you can see the one we actually just ran. That says 5 o'clock. So let me refresh. I'm going to go in the far right to configure, and then I'm going to change the time interval to last hour. And there's the one I just ran compared to the previous one, which increased a little in average time here. In configuration, so I'm looking at track queries, you can see there's a bunch of different things you could look at. Here I have the query to track, and then I have a series of metrics, a bunch that I can use here. Interesting, I even have one, or they've given me one called tempDB memory used. So I can actually track queries to see if it's affecting tempDB. I mean, how cool is that? I think the first one I would go to is row count, because I'm thinking, oh, let's see how many rows were returned. But usually that one is if you got a query that might be from a store procedure that's parameterized, and at one point it gets 10 rows, and the other one it gets 100 rows. So you can do some correlation with what was the query returning versus, you know, at 4 o'clock versus what might be done at 10 a.m. But I'm looking here at durations in milliseconds and the average statistic. I could look at max, min, standard deviation, and even total. So you have a bunch of variety here. In the bottom part, you have intervals from custom to already some fixed different types. I'm going to go ahead and say look at last week, and you're going to see different queries. So over time, or different plans, over time, you can see these different plans coming into fact. Now I just clicked on this little yellow one, and if you notice in the bottom, I have a column store index. But in the current one, plan 6, I don't have the column store. So lately, that column store was removed. So somewhere in the last day, in the morning, the column store was removed. Maybe at 6 a.m., the ETL process was removing it and then forgot to add it, or maybe it bombed and it didn't get added back. So just a scenario, and you know, my plan is cruising along. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that create index, and I'm actually create this column store. It did it pretty quick, probably because everything's in memory right now. But now I'm going to go back to my tabular model, and I'm going to go process this whole thing. So it's processing the data. You can see it might take a little bit longer this time. And I'm going to go back to my query, track queries, and I'm going to try to refresh. Now remember right here, I've got this guy about 5 o'clock. That's plan 6. I'm going to do a refresh, and it didn't show it to me yet. So I'm going to click on configure, and I'm going to say the last hour. Let's see if we can get that one displayed. There it is. Cool. So based on that data flush and collection interval is how often it's going to fill this up. But if you notice here, I got a new plan, and I'm going to click on it once. I'm going to hold down my shift key. I'm going to click on the other one, and there's a button here called Compare Plans. I can compare to see what the differences are. So if I click on the select part of the query, I have over to my right the regular properties that you see on these iterators, and you'll see these little not equal signs. So the estimated subtree cost was 1.3 and it was 2.3. So almost got a 2 times increase in the performance of this particular query. Now, it's harder to look at the end leaf parts because the clustered index scan for internet sales was switched with column store. Now, if you notice too, there's a highlight of red. So SQL Server is trying to provide for you what change that might be significant. And if you notice, this guy costs 97% and this one costs 56%. So SQL Server is saying, hey, this is the biggest change. But we know since we added the column store that the cost was decreased because of a new type of index. Now, I'm just showing you this as a great example, but you can imagine if you have a query in the middle of the day, changing plans, now you'd be able to compare what actually changed in the plan. I mean, I would, if you never saw this and you never could compare plans, I'm sure you're clapping right now. When I saw this, I was just simply amazed. There's even more. I can click, if I don't like that plan, I can click on this old plan and I can click this button, Force Plan. And now when I run that query again, and I go back, try to refresh after it's finished, you can see it went back to the old plan. So even though the compiled plan, which was better, runs better, I can still force it to do the old plan. So this is how you can force query plans. And if you didn't know this, lo and behold, one of the reports is queries with force plans. And check it out. You can see the select statements. That is the plan. And you can see where they're forced. So if you know that that one shouldn't be forced anymore, you can click it and turn off the force part of it. I don't see it on the screen because it's a little off, but now I can unforce the plan and remove that particular plan. Pretty neat, huh? Everybody says, yay. So that was a demo of the plan changing. So let's just talk about the dashboards before we end this. In this database under the Query Store folder, you have 7 as of 2009. You might have less with older versions or if you're using a different compatibility version. One of the nicest one, which is first on the list, is regressed queries. It's telling you which queries regressed. So you can still go to the metrics, choose the different ones, and it's going to give you the top level queries that the plans have regressed. And I mean, that's just the easiest way to pinpoint where you should be going. The metrics are duration in milliseconds, CPU time in milliseconds, which can be different because of different weights. Excuse me. And what's nice is most of these reports have 3 panes. In your upper left, you have the metrics. In your upper right, you have the plan summary. It's usually a graph based on the metric that you pick. And below is the execution plan, which is real nice. You got 2 graphs, data you can look at along with the plan. That's just unbelievable. You'd have to flip through screens previously before this. Those bar charts are for significance, whereas the summary is a dot plot of the metrics based on the selected query. So those bars that you see, these bars, you can switch between the bars, and each one is a different query. So let's go look at the regress query. So let's go to regress queries, and we can see this guy here, 150, which is that sum of sales amount, one of those ones I was running in the query window, seems to regress with additional duration. So it seems to have gone up in plan. So that might be one. I want to go back to the old plan and force it, so I don't have this worse plan that's using it. But here's what I'm talking about in the left. In these bar charts, you can go from query to query to query. Now, if you notice, I hover over it, it kind of gives me a summary of the query. And this one has from query store plan. So other than that one that's actually inside of the database, a query of the database tables, the next ones are query store queries that seem to be a bad, not bad performance, but the most regressed queries. And I mean, you don't have to performance tune these, but when you get something like that, you might go look at something different, like, let me look at CPU time, and instead of total, average it. And then I might see some of these queries that are more relevant to the database itself. And so I can switch between the different types, and I can see the different statistics on it, as well as the query plan. And here's that missing index, and just like a regular execution plan, I can right click on it, missing index details, and I could create that index. Of course, I wouldn't do this on production. I would do it in a dev or QA environment first, and then see if it improves the performance of that query, if it's a problem. The particular CPU time here, 50 milliseconds, that might not be so bad. But that's our regress queries, which is one of the top ones I see people use. The other ones are top resource consuming. So now your bar chart is based on, is it CPU, is it memory, is it IO? There's even that row count. And surprising to me when I examine this, there's even one for degrees of parallelism. So if you don't know about parallelism, you could see if the parallelism is one of the top consumers, or what queries are the top consumers of parallelism. Why would you do that? Well, if you got a bunch of queries running parallel and they're not big reporting type queries, there might be something wrong with the query itself, and it might need to be performance tuned if it's actually running in parallel, or you might need to adjust your max DOP on the server or database level. Again, you got the three planes like regress queries. You got the metrics, the plan summary, and the execution plan. We looked at the configuration where you can select the time frame, top or min type plans. You can even tell it, this says top 25, but you might want to see the top 5, top 100, whatever suits your interest at that particular time. And then the one we originally saw was the track queries. Now all the other reports, if you double click one of those bars and it is a query, it'll jump to the track queries report. So we'll do that in a second, where we float between reports without actually having to run them. The compare plan we saw, so you can view the query in that compare plan, and you can force the plan, which we looked at, but again, you use this with caution. So we forced that one for query 69 to look at the non-clustered column store index versus the one with the column store indexes. So let's go look at a couple more of the reports and see how we can drill around. So I'm going to close most of these queries, just so I can start with a clean slate. And I'm going to go to the top consuming resources. So here I got top 25. It's kind of cluttered, so I might go down here and say, just show me top 5. Now I see that 69 guy. If I double click it, well, that one didn't go to the next one. Let me go to overall resource consuming. So here is 4 different panes, one by duration, execution count, CPU time, logical reads. If I click on one of these, so I'm interested in the resource consumption in this last day for CPU. When I click on it, it automatically goes to this top 25 consuming. Now, oh, I'm sorry, you can't double click it. What you can do is highlight it. Let me see if I want to get a different one. Yeah, that's a good one. So over here in the top, there's a track selected query. If I click that, it jumps to that particular query. So to the track queries report and feeds it the number. So we went from overall consumption, which could be your dashboard, to clicking on a particular bar. If you notice also, there's a standard grid. So you can actually look at a table of that particular set of, this one is in particular is execution count. So you can actually see the details of the statistics, the runtime statistics of each one of those. I can do it here as well. But what I was saying is when we come into here and we click on that bar, it actually jumps to another report that lets us highlight a particular query and then actually go to the track queries. We saw the force plan, and there's even one queries with high variation. So I've tried to dig into this one a little more. It's telling me based on duration milliseconds that this one in particular varies more than the rest. Now, most of these are the query store ones. So again, what I got to do is play around with my CPU time to find one that's actually a one inside of the database, which it doesn't look like any of these are. And if you notice, when you hover over it, you can get a lot of information. So here is 143, which is a sum, a sales amount, grouping by calendar year. So I could just see that it had a variation that it didn't like. And again, I can drill in to that particular query. The last one is query weight statistics. So if you're a big weight statistics person, you can actually look at the weight statistics that it's calculating. This is a new one either in 2017 or 2019 that is based on the collection of weight stats. And if you notice, I'll go back one, I'm interested in buffer IO. I click on buffer IO and it's going to drill into those queries. Up in the top here is a little arrow that lets me go back. So as I go forward, I still have the ability to go back. Now, didn't want to look at total weight, maybe average weight. Network IO seems to be a problem, and that probably is the async network IO, which is the client communicating with the server. But here I can refresh, drill into that particular query. I can view the text of the query, and instead of having a bar chart, I can go to a table layout, and I can actually see the queries that it's selected for average wait times and network IO. And when I scroll to the right, I'm doing the average wait, but in this table, I can still sort by other things. I can say, oh, I want to look at standard deviation. So I can change within that table the actual sorting of those particular ones. Some of these even let you look at the number of plans. This is not one in particular, but if there was some that have a table and one of the last columns has number of plans. So my category weight is memory here. If I go back and do configure, again, I could say all, how many to return in each weight. Let me just say 5 and 15 here. And then instead of the last hour, I might want to say the last 2 weeks. Might get a little more information. Idle time in the last 2 weeks seems greater than the rest. So me doing a custom here probably is best, so I can eliminate weights like idle that aren't necessary to do performance tuning. There's my CPUs. I could drill into those. And of course, you see in the right the summary for each one. And we clicked on the particular query that needs a missing index and has a forced plan. So in all likelihood, I might want to unforce that plan, go test around with adding an index, and then come back to the query plan to see what happens. So that's a good rundown of the reports available as of 2019. Let me go back to the slides. All right. So we'll stop there. It's about 11 minutes to the hour, and we'll see if there's any questions that want to be posed.
Okay, thanks Thomas for such an informative presentation. And basically there are a couple of questions. So there are 3 questions basically. One is a general question and others 2 are like technical questions. So shall we start from the technical questions? Yeah, so the one question asked by Fanny. So Fanny asked, are there any performance, Fanny asked, why does even the SQL plan change right in the middle of the day?
Why does a query plan change in the middle of the day?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the most likely answer to that one is um, first thing I would do is check to see if the query is parameterized. So if it's changing in the middle of the day, then probably maybe the parameter pass is returning a smaller subset of data. So the plan originally is created with 10,000 rows, and then a value goes in there that only returns 3 or 4 rows, and the plan decides to recompile. I mean, that's one of the most common ones, but the typical answer you'll get from anybody in the SQL Server world is going to be, it depends. And it really does depend on the SQL that is actually executing. But if you're not using Query Store, turn on Query Store, track that query, and see what those runtime statistics are for the different plans. And you can do that with what we saw today. I can actually go into that query, look at that table, and I could see the different columns of metrics, and I could see, one plan versus the other of what actually changed. Or I can do that compare plan and then look at the properties on the right, and I could drill down into the estimated IO, the estimated CPU, or the estimated rows return, and see if anything's different. One of those ones that we saw, let me see if I can flip back to the track query to that 69 and compare these two plans. Let me show you real quick that compare the plan. Here, if I go down to the select part of it, there's one thing that has, oh man, where is it at? One has the batch mode versus row mode. Yeah, so you here see it says batch mode on row true, and then here there's actually nothing. So the plan is changed where it's actually doing a batch mode instead of a row by row mode. So that's just one example that the column store does to change the plan.
Okay, so there are some more questions come up. So the second question is where query store data is stored.
The query store data is stored in your database. So when I right clicked, went to properties, and went to query store, this little display on the bottom is showing me the query store data, and it's within the primary file group of that database. So when you turn on query store, it's turned on database by database. You got to do it for each individual database, and that data is stored within the database.
Okay, so another question is, are there any performance issues with the query store that we wanted to let it run more often for general performance needs?
So what you have to think about when you're doing a query store is you're not looking to track each individual SPID and the performance that's going on throughout the whole day. You're looking at an aggregation of what's going on to drill in later. So you don't want to set it up where your collection is every 1 minute and your interval is 1 minute, because it's just going to put too much data in it. That's why these statistics and thresholds and aggregations are in there. So you're looking at kind of a eagle's eye view of what the system's doing at the time. You don't want to have it where it's actually giving you performance issues just because you want to collect everything. If you're at that point, you want to do some sort of extended events, and horrible to say based on some people, but the profiler. If you need more granular level of queries, then you want to use that stuff. The query store is more of a high level, how's my system running? If you put it where it's collecting a lot of data, it's got that limit of max size, and it'll turn it off. It'll turn it back on read only, so it doesn't cause performance issues. So there's enough checks and balances in here not to cause it, but it's possible to do that. Erin Stellato from SQL Skills has a lot of blogs about Query Store. I would suggest reading her blog, and she'll give you more information about that.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. So the next question is, how can we check if the plan used is a forced plan from the execution plan of the query? Any keyword to check in the execution plan properties?
Yeah, so this report, queries with forced plans, will show you every plan that's forced inside of that database. If you need the query to query this yourself outside of the CAN reports, you can search online for Query Store system views, and it'll give you that information.
Okay, so the next question is, do you have any recommendations for enabling Query Store on heavily loaded transactional environments? Yeah.
Yeah, take all the defaults, let it start it in a not a busy part of the day, and see what it collects. If you're blessed enough to be able to duplicate your production environment and do a replay with extended events or profiler, you could do it there first to see how it does collecting. I would suggest doing a not a heavy transactional system first, and then kind of scale it down. Again, Erin Stellato with SQL Skills has a bunch of analysis from being a consultant looking at different systems, and I think she says there's only one that looked like that they couldn't do it, and it was because they had a lot of ad hoc type queries. But you can go to her blog and she has more details for you.
Okay, so the next question is by Jeff. Can we manage Query Store information such as retrieval via T-SQL or PowerShell?
Yeah, that's one of the slides I showed with some of the queries to the Query Store's DMVs and DMVs, and you can create your own analysis on it. You don't have to use the CAN reports. So yes, you can.
Okay, so the next one is, what happens if forced plan becomes invalid?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that one.
Okay.
I'm assuming if it's forced that you can't knock it out of the system, but I could be wrong. I know this much is I actually forced so my track query. Remember how I forced that plan? I forced it on the column store. Let me see where it's at here. Yeah, so watch. I'm gonna force the column store plan. Okay, and then I'm gonna go delete that index. Right. So I forced a plan on a column store index, and the index doesn't exist no more. If I go run my model, it runs successfully. So it's smart enough to know if you have a forced plan and it can't run the plan based on the missing index, it goes and grabs a different plan.
Okay, so the next question is, what happens if a forced plan this answered. And next one is to turn on and off Query Store where it impacts database availability, meaning
no,
the database.
Yeah, I see the question. No, it's turning it on and off has no impact on the availability of the database. Nope.
Okay, perfect. So the last one is, what was the name of the blog contact for Query Store again, please?
Yeah, her
blog name.
Erin Stellato, something like that. But she's with SQLskills.com.
Okay. Cool.
Looks like it, huh?
Yeah. So I think that's all questions.
Great.
Yeah,
is
there more? Okay.
Is it Roberta?
Yeah, okay, I think it's time. So
Yep.
Thank you for everyone, and stay tuned for our next session. Maintain SQL Server performance baseline with PowerShell with Alan White. So thank you, Thomas, for your such an informative presentation, and thank you everyone for your attending. Thank you. Have a nice one.
Thank you.